Hey guys, Peter here to do an album review, and I'm here today to tell you about the latest from Hypocrisy, Worship, out November 26 on Nuclear Blast. This album has 11 tracks, 51 minutes in length, and this is the band's 13th full-length studio album. They are an iconic Swedish death metal band. I like how they put this record together. It has a sense of start and the way the intro is built into the first song of the album, Worship. And I like the way it ends because it has an outro built into the last song of the record. When you look at those two songs in terms of how they start and how they finish, they kind of go almost full circle. They're very well interconnected between one and the other, using a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same atmosphere that creates across those two tracks. So this is an album that has a start, has a finish, but then it also goes full circle when you look beyond just the boundaries of the record itself. So from a structural perspective, this is the best way to create a box for an album, a box that then allows the songs within it to be very dynamic. This is not an album that offers a linear approach. It doesn't have a one-size-fits-all in terms of the atmosphere or even in terms of the execution from the first to the last song. There's a lot of diversity of approaches, a lot of diversity of constructions, and when you put these songs together, when you have this kind of a melting pot, you end up with an album that has peaks and valleys, but it always takes you forward. It always gives you a sense of knowing exactly where you are within the journey of the record, and that journey is one that moves you from song to song with that finish line at the end of that journey. So it's a record that doesn't offer pauses, that doesn't have breaks. It does have some songs that slow down, but overall the record is all about the speed in which it takes you from the first to the last track. Sometimes you go a little bit faster, sometimes you go a little bit slower, but you're always moving in one single direction. This allows the album to be dynamic, to be versatile, but at the same time to be very cohesive and feel as one unit. Within the sound of this record, you definitely see the death metal having the presence there. It's the spinal cord, it's the DNA of the band, and they didn't go far from it. I just felt like they opened the umbrella of death metal and they use influences from all the other genres that come underneath it. And that perhaps is one of the key elements that creates that diversity of sound, that volatility from track to track, even within tracks themselves, that makes this record as robust as it is, but at the same time as engaging as it sounds. It's a really well-crafted album, an album that for the listener, when you reach the end, it's very easy for you to look back and decipher what the songs were all about, decipher all the elements that went into making them. And it's also easy for you to identify each song by certain characteristics that they have. So this is now one of those death metal albums that becomes very hard for you to define the forest from the trees, because it all sounds very similar to itself. It all sounds very together, and by the time you reach the record, everything was kind of a blur. This record is not like that. It has defined parameters on a song-by-song basis. It has defined parameters across the overall soundscape of the album, and it's an album that is also very easy for the listener to process. This is not an overly complicated record. It's an album that you can just grasp quickly what it's all about, what the songs are doing, where are they taking you, and then you just go with the flow. You just go throughout this record just following the fluidity that the album naturally holds within its structure and within its soundscape. Deeper within the sound, the album is really driven by two main elements, and that is the drums and the guitars. They have the more predominant roles, if you will, in the overall experience that this album has to offer. Not to say that the bass does not play an important part of this album, but is not as predominant, is not necessarily as influential as the drums and the guitars are. I really enjoy the bass, but perhaps more so because it didn't get in the way. It added a little bit of flavor, it added a little bit of nuances, but it allowed the drums and guitars to do everything that they needed to do in order for the experience of this album to be what it is. Having said that, the drums have perhaps more of a secondary role to the guitars. The guitars are really the motor, the heartbeat of this album. They drive the experience, they drive the dynamic elements that the songs have are really pushed forward by what the guitars are doing, either being a little bit more chunky, a little bit groovier, a little bit thicker, a little bit more melodic, a little bit more brutal. So the guitars really determine exactly where these songs are going and overall the direction that the record is taking and how you're going to get to that point that you want to get to. The drums, like I said, sit a little bit more in the back seat. They're more of a passenger for this ride, but once again, just like the bass, a very important passenger, because I felt like they created an important bass line, an important foundation for the overall record. I don't think you can have the guitars being as dynamic, as prolific as they are on this record without the drums considering themselves the solid bass, the foundation of the album, allowing those guitars to grow a little bit more. So while not necessarily jumping into the forefront and being overly powerful and perhaps hiding some of the other elements with its force, with its aggression, with its heaviness, the drums still play a very important role in creating, or at least helping to create, the parameters that define the construction of this album when it comes to the soundscape, when it comes to how these songs will be perceived by the listener. Once you get to the vocals, Peter is on top of his game. Phenomenal performance vocally on this record from beginning to end. I felt like he always brought a little bit extra on every single track, depending on the mood of the song, depending on the atmosphere, but perhaps even more so depending on the lyrical content. He was really able to bring those lyrics to life with a little bit more emotion. This is an album that from a vocal perspective feels a little bit more organic. It feels a little bit more natural. It doesn't feel forced. And because of that, the overall song construction and the overall delivery works really well, while still keeping some dynamic elements, keeping some changes, some nuances within the overall performance that really goes wherever the tracks are going. So this symbiosis of sound and vocals becomes very important for the overall construction of this album and for the impact that the sound of this record is going to have on the listener. A record that I felt that was so well crafted. It doesn't have cracks. It's not a record that you could see something is missing or something is not there, or it doesn't feel right, or it doesn't feel natural. This is a very organic sounding album. It feels very well put together. It's very well constructed overall when you look at the individual song construction, when you look at the overall design of the record. But the soundscape of this album is so robust without being overburdened for the listener. You're able to enjoy the experience that the sound gives you. You're able to enjoy everything that comes under that death metal umbrella, sometimes a little bit more melodic, sometimes a little bit more doomy, sometimes a little bit more brutal. So you have all of these speed changes happening from song to song that makes the album so engaging, so interesting, not really giving you a chance to understand exactly what's coming around the corner, because you feel like it's always going to be something different, or at least they're going to use the same elements but in a different format. And that sort of novelty really works well for this record, because it also has some other elements that keep the album consistent, that keep the album grounded. So it's an album that has volatility, but at the same time it has borders around that volatility. Just really well constructed, really well executed album all around. As far as my favorite songs are concerned, I want to start off with Greedy Bastards. Chunky guitars, heavy drums, the combination of these two working in parallel, giving a little bit more of a thrash vibe to how this song comes across, but in making a very impactful track that pounds you at every single turn, musically and vocally. It's a very strong track from both ends of that spectrum. It has ebbs and flows. It doesn't stay linear. It doesn't stay flat. It makes the track more dynamic. It makes the track more engaging. The chorus is melodic, is hooky, is very catchy. Using some backing vocals in the chorus adds to that hookiness, adds to the fact that the chorus becomes a little bit more of a earworm, and it's really hard for you to walk away from this track without having that chorus play in the background of your mind. So I really like that aspect. But overall, when you look at the construction of this song, it feels very simple, very straightforward, to the point. Next we have We Are the Walking Dead, a more subdued track. I felt like it had some doom elements, almost like a death doom track in terms of how it's put together, the overall construction that it has, but more so perhaps from the atmosphere that it creates. It has a haunting atmosphere through and through. There are moments where that haunting atmosphere comes into the forefront, becoming perhaps a little bit more noticeable, and then there's some elements where it drops a little bit more into the background. I would say that that aspect is perhaps more prevalent in the verses. The verses have that haunting nature to them in terms of how they sound and how the vocals attach themselves to that atmosphere. Then once you move into the chorus is a little bit more melodic. It has a little bit more energy. The vocals also grow a little bit. So it's a track that has two different sides, but those two sides coexist really well with one another all the way throughout. Perhaps not the one that's most aggressive, not the one that's most powerful, but one of my favorite tracks on the album because it really broke the mood. It's the song that perhaps takes you to the deepest point of this record, at least from an emotional perspective and from an atmospheric perspective as well. Last but not least, Children of the Grey, great guitar intro. I love how this song starts. That built-in intro is just absolutely perfect. It adds also volume. The song gains volume as it progresses. The vocals become very penetrating, specifically through the portions of the track that are also very penetrating, that don't have as much thickness to them. When the song gains volume, when the song gains heaviness and becomes a little bit thicker, the vocals also come in and match that same intensity, match that same approach. So this is a track that the ebbs and flows are happening not just musically, but they're also happening vocally, allowing the track to feel more chaotic, more dynamic, but very controlled within the space, within the footprint that it has. And then it finishes off with that same guitar intro as it started. There's some feedback in the background, creating a little bit more aggression at the end. You didn't get that at the beginning, but the melody is exactly the same. The execution is exactly the same. It just has a little bit of layers on top of it. So having that start and that finish coming together really works well for a song like this, because it gives you a sense of continuity throughout the track and then going full circle, finishing as it had started. This is it. Hypocrisy with Worship, out November 26th on Nuclear Blast. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the singles. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.